My mom didn't come home last night. The words arrived like a small bell in the hollow between gusts, a child's inside voice against the wind, hardly more than a prayer. Snow fretted the iron gate in white filigree. Tiny boot prints, already half erased, led away from the road and toward the lights of a house that had never belonged to her world. Ella Morgan stood on the outer stone step, her red backpack snug against her shoulder like a heartbeat. Snow melted on her lashes. The hem of a too-thin dress clung to her knees. She had walked a long way. The air between her and the mansion smelled of chimney smoke and cedar, a warmth she had imagined all the way from the factory doorstep. She had practiced what she would say, how to ask for help. The words felt enormous when she said them aloud. A shadow detached itself from the front portico. The man who emerged was not a gardener or a passing driver. He wore a coat cut for boardrooms, and an expression honed by decisions that rarely required gloves or shoveling. Ethan Caldwell took in the child in a single, measured sweep. The red of the backpack, the number of snow-layered footprints, the firmness in the set of a small chin. "Are you lost?" he asked, before he knew why he asked. Ella looked up, as if someone had turned the light of the world toward her. Her voice was a paper-thin thing, but steady. "My mom didn't come home last night." Ethan's first, practical thought belonged to logistics. Call a car service, warm the child, find the local shelter. Then he saw the way snow clung to her hair and the way she smelled faintly of oil and dust. And something in the calculus of his day hiccuped. There was an urgency there that statistics could not hold. He opened the gate. Inside, the house breathed warm and strange to the girl. She had never been inside a place with rugs that swallowed sound, or a fireplace that threw a whole world of light. Ethan shepherded her to the hearth, removed his coat, and wrapped it around her shoulders. He set aside the briefcase he had been carrying, an absurdly small thing of paper and priorities, then knelt to unlace the tiny boots, a minister of practical mercy. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ella," she said. Her fingers dug into the coat as if the fabric were a talisman. "Ella, I'm Ethan. Where's your mom?" He tried to make the question a map, not a trap. Ella's answer came slow. "Scarlett works at the night place. She told me to sleep when she got back, but she didn't. I woke up and the door was locked, and I couldn't find her, and—" She swallowed. The final, small surrender of a child's world. She didn't come home. Ethan listened, the house's warmth rising in his chest like an inconvenient truth. He tried a dozen executive phrases in his head, protocol, security, emergency contacts, and found them all thin. There was only the small, honest panic of a child who had walked through a blizzard and laid her misgivings at a stranger's feet. He handed Ella his phone. "Do you know your mom's number?" She shook her head. "No. She says numbers are for when someone is not there." Her brow puckered with a wisdom only children can carry, practical and unknowable at once. Ethan called the number the front desk gave him, and then the city emergency line. When neither fulfilled what he needed, names, addresses, a pulse of community, he did what felt right. He took the girl to the nearest hospital himself. The drive was a brief, stuttering movie of taillights and snow-blown white. Ella drummed her small hands in Ethan's lap as if practicing counting $100 decisions into simpler units of comfort. In the emergency room, under fluorescence and the smell of antiseptic, Ella curled into the coat and slept with the kind of exhaustion that does not know safe. The admitting nurse had a face softened by long shifts and the quick math of triage. When the intake revealed Scarlett Morgan's employer, a name tickled Ethan's memory: Holden Manufacturing, the same Holden plant that supplied parts for the machines under his company's brand, the same industry rhythm that hummed under cities. "She worked nights?" the nurse asked, filling out the forms with a pen that made small, decisive clicks. Ella nodded. She works nights, so I can sleep. There was no melodrama here, only thin forms and the quiet efficiency of professionals unafraid of true sorrow. Later, when a doctor came in with a clipboard and a kindness reserved for unexpected emergencies, the word hypoglycemia came like a chord struck in the wrong key. Scarlett had collapsed at her station. Exhaustion and low blood sugar had met and won for a few hours. Now she was stable, but fragile. Ethan sat in a chair that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He watched Ella awake under the hospital's softened light and draw the shape of a house on a sticky strip of notepad. 2 windows, a crooked roof, a woman leaning out of a door. The house had a red dot on its porch. He stared at the drawing longer than he should have, feeling an unaccountable squeeze. After the doctor left, Ethan walked the hospital hallway like someone who had been given the wrong instructions for a life he thought he knew. The receptionist had found a contact number on a time card, Scarlett's supervisor at Holden. The supervisor's voice on the phone was a murmur of shift exchanges and the tight algebra of labor. They had called an ambulance for a collapsed employee. A friend had found her when the night shift ended. Her bag, her coat, her time-stamped log, all the small evidences of a person kept on a ledger. Ethan asked to see the log. He wanted to know exact hours. The nurse, used to the politeness of strangers turned saviors, typed them in. The record showed a string of double shifts, extended hours after equipment breakdowns, 10, maybe 12-hour stretches punctured by 30-minute breaks that were often skipped. Ella's mother's name sat among many others. Hands that had kept the night moving while the rest of the world slept. He had not come to this hospital on a crusade. He had come because a little girl in a red backpack had climbed the steps of his house and entrusted those words to the cold air. But the ledger moved in his chest like a second heartbeat. He felt ethics in a new key. He felt something he would later call accountability. In the moment, it was simply a clean, sharp question. How had the night come to this? Back in the waiting room, a curtain of snow sliced the glass into frozen diamonds. Ella asked for cocoa. The nurse smiled and returned with a styrofoam cup that steamed in the cold party light and a plastic spoon too big for her mouth. She sipped, her small shoulders eased. She sat leaning against Ethan as if he were a piece of furniture designed for holding. "Do you have somewhere to go after this?" he asked, the question feeling monstrous in its breadth. Social services, shelters, the city's slow but solid safety net, the words were all floating outside the hospital's warm bubble. "No," Ella said. "We go back to the factory. Mom said we have to be quiet when she sleeps days." The admission lodged in Ethan like a stone. He could feel the shape of the life that had pushed this child into the snow. A small apartment with thin insulation, a mother who worked nights to keep enough in the bank for bread and rent, a clockwork of schedules that left little margin for error. There were edges in corporate reports where human beings fell through. He had always thought of them as statistics, not the geometry of a child's sleepless feet. He called someone he barely knew. He dialed the office and asked to be put through to his head of operations. The line clicked like a lifeline. He spoke fast, his vocabulary pared down by the need to be immediate. He asked about union compliance, about the Holden plant scheduling, about whether extended shifts had been reported. He asked for the plant's daily logs to be brought to him and for HR to review any incident reports in the last 30 days. The assistant on the other end hesitated in that bureaucratic way that wants to filter empathy through policy. "That will take some time, sir," she said carefully. "We can have an overview by tomorrow." "No," Ethan said. He realized how loud his voice had become. "I need it tonight. Bring me the logs, start an internal note, tell legal to stand by." He was still learning the currency of influence. It felt like privilege used as a small, sharp tool. The hospital let them stay. At 3 in the morning, when the other rooms breathed in a low symphony of machines and soft snoring, Scarlett Morgan woke to the undercurrent of human attention. Her lids opened slow. The unfamiliar light of an ER made everything white and honest. She had a tube in her arm and a nurse at her elbow. The nurse's voice was a small, warm protocol. Scarlett's memory came back in fragments. The machines beeping in the factory, the slip of space between warning and collapse. Her first real thought, practiced and pragmatic, was for Ella. "Is my girl—" Scarlett's voice cracked. The question hung, raw and human. "She's safe," a voice answered. It was Ethan who had been hovering at the periphery, pairs of shadow and suit. He said nothing more than that at first. He could feel Scarlett's eyes take him in, this man who had been inexplicably generous with his coat and his time. Scarlett's gaze flicked to Ella through the curtained window, to the small figure who was folding and unfolding a napkin as if it were a map. Scarlett's chest heaved. She was a woman who had learned to measure pride in the coins that fit in her palm. Accepting charity was a calculus of humility. "I can go back," she said, at once pride and fear stitched together. "I'll be fine. It was a bad—" "You're not going back tonight," the doctor interjected, soft but absolute. They recommended fluids, food, observation. Hypoglycemia could be acute and, if unaddressed, dangerous. It would take more than a cup of coffee and an apology to make a night shift healthy again. "You need rest," the doctor said. Later, in the sterile waiting area, Ethan watched Scarlett, her laugh absent, her shoulders carrying an invisible weight, and felt something he had not felt at quarterly reviews or shareholder meetings. There was a human cost to the hum of engines and the click of conveyor belts, and there were people who kept them humming. He had profit models, he had papers that proved society's needs in elegant charts. He had never, until now, held a child's trembling into his hands and had her confess that her mother did not come home. He spoke to HR on his way out of the hospital, through a voice that did not permit layers. "Start an audit," he said. "Hold in scheduling logs for the last 60 days, break compliance, overtime, everything. Put plant supervision on notice. I want a review of safety procedures. We move on this now. Mandatory breaks enforced, an emergency fund for on-shift incidents, something for single parents." He swallowed, aware of the dramaturgy of his choices. He did not want to be a sudden savior. He wanted to be a lever. "Sir," said the voice he had given orders to, careful and weary, "that will ripple. It will require legal clearance. There are contracts and unions." "Do it how it has to be done," Ethan said. "But by morning, I want an interim directive. No double shifts without documented consent. No missed lunches without supervisor reports. If someone is at the hospital, they get paid for the shift." The woman on the phone, an HR director who had been schooled in the art of doing what is right without becoming reckless, accepted the mandate. "We'll begin immediately," she said. "I'll coordinate with operations and legal and notify plant management." He hung up and found Ella asleep on a lumpy couch, a drawing folded into her fist. Her breathing was the soft metronome of someone who had given all she could for the day. Ethan smoothed the red backpack strap over her shoulder and felt the strange gravity of new responsibility settle in his bones. "Sir?" the nurse asked gently. "Are you related?" "No," Ethan said before he could decide whether the answer mattered. He could have said no and meant it, and still the word would not explain the way his hands stayed on the child's shoulders. He thought of the time he had spent inside his company, calculations, mergers, presentations, and wondered at the division between his world and the steady, sleep-starving world of the factory. He felt a shift, small as frost at first contact, then inevitable in how it changed the light on things. The hospital released Scarlett after a day of observation. She wore a hospital bracelet like a small badge of chastened survival. In the parking lot, snow scabbed the pavement. Ella leapt into her mother's arms the way people fall into prayers, fast and all at once. Scarlett's hair was damp, her hands still showing the little blisters of a life spent turning bolts and moving parts. When she looked at Ethan, there was a complicated gratitude, not for a check or a performance, but for a stranger who had commanded the possibility of change. "Thank you," she said, and the words were private and wide. "No thanks necessary," Ethan said. The line felt tender to him. He did not want to make promises that the ledger could not keep. He drove back to his house under a sky that still held stormlight and an argument with himself. In the quiet of his office, he could hear the echo of Ella's small voice. He thought of the time cards, the night shifts, the way an entire city's industry had become invisible at night. He knew that changing memos and shifting policies would not rewrite history in a day, but he also knew that failing to act would be a different kind of negligence. If this story is finding you in the same room, if the line, somewhere deep in you, tugs at the idea that small things can be made right, consider subscribing for more stories like this. There are lives in the margins worth noticing. Back at Caldwell Industries, Ethan sat at his desk and tapped out an email that felt like a private oath. "Immediate audit of Holden Manufacturing," he typed, then paused. He added language chosen to balance urgency with procedure. Interim safety directives, mandatory reporting, emergency assistance for affected employees. He sent the memo with dispatch, copying HR, operations, and legal. The message was a small declaration. We had seen one consequence and would trace back the cause. The next morning, the plant hum had the same stubborn rhythm as always. Machines ate the same hours, belts and pistons, and the human hands that guided them. But now a brown envelope lay on the foreman's desk, the company's crest stamped in black. When he opened it, there were memos and a schedule for retraining and a request for logs. Concrete, paper-threaded obligations that would, unglamorously, demand attention. Ethan's directive did not change the city overnight. There were phone calls with legal counsel that stretched into careful phrasing. There were union representatives who asked for consultation before policies became prescriptions. There were operations managers who muttered about costs and precedent. Every person had a language: law, labor, compassion, numbers. For once, Ethan listened to each. He allowed the friction to exist while insisting the spark that began this change, Ella's voice, remain the center of the conversation. At the plant, Scarlett went back to work with the same cautious resolve she had always worn. The foreman, who had seen workers folded into spreadsheets for years, tried not to let the notice about audits feel like an indictment. He offered a small, practical kindness that meant more than he likely realized. He arranged for a temporary shift adjustment so she could sleep in daylight and be with Ella when the child returned from school. Scarlett accepted with the same stubborn grace with which she had accepted hardship. She did not ask for accolades. She wanted two things: enough hours to pay the bills, and a life where her daughter did not have to become sacrifice. Ethan visited the Holden facility under the ostensible plan of oversight. He wanted to see, in person, the place where the night met its people, and where those people made the city's work possible with a constancy he had previously noticed only in charts. The plant was a cavern of noise and light. Machines thudded like heartbeats. Blue safety vests moved in practiced choreography. The air smelled of hot metal and the careful oil of maintained things. He walked the floor with a supervisor at his elbow. He watched hands that were both deft and calloused. He listened as a woman explained how breaks had to be taken while the line slowed, how supervisors juggled productivity and human needs. He looked into the face of a woman who worked the same line Scarlett had, her hair tied back, her eyes carrying a history of nights. The woman spoke quickly, not complaining, but cataloging the small ways management and necessity tangled. "We do our best," she said, "but sometimes the equipment breaks and there are no spare parts and the overtime piles on. We tell each other to keep the line going. If we stop, the company loses a day. We lose days." Ethan watched, taking in the arithmetic of endurance. He thought of Ella's red backpack and of the drawing, the crooked house with the red dot. It struck him that what he had always called operational risk had names and children and refrigerator lights that needed to stay on. He ordered an immediate review of maintenance schedules and spare part inventories. He insisted on transcripts of the communications between floor supervisors and plant managers for the week Scarlett had collapsed. He looked for evidence of whether the night shift had been understaffed or whether equipment failure had forced people into extra hours out of necessity rather than choice. The audit did not exonerate anyone with a flourish. In its pages were small failures: a delayed parts order, a supervisor who had not logged a mandatory break, a culture where skipping a meal on the line was more praised than questioned. There was no malevolence, only accumulation, little decisions that compounded into risk. There were also bright spots: workers who covered for each other, a mechanic who had repeatedly bypassed a flawed safety guard because it meant the line would keep moving for the night's hapless order. The audit's truth was not cinematic. It was therefore more dangerous. It demanded slow, unglamorous work. Ethan felt the responsibility of his role like a weight that could be used for leverage or as a cudgel. He called a meeting with operations and legal, with HR present like a mediator between hearts and rules. He asked the room to see the people behind the numbers. He asked for interim safety protocols and for a fund to cover employees whose shifts were interrupted by emergencies. He wanted to extend compassion in ways the company could sustain without unraveling. "You're asking us to change the way we operate at night," the operations director said. "That's not a light lift. It affects delivery times, costs, client expectations." "I'm asking us to honor the people who stay up so the world can run in daylight," Ethan said. "It's not an ideological choice. It's a practical one. We can make this reasonable. We can prevent another collapse." The room hummed like a machine of bureaucracy. There were charts placed like shields and legal caveats that sounded like lullabies for the cautious. But in one corner, a young HR analyst, a woman who had been the daughter of a single parent herself, had tears in her eyes. She had seen the hospital badge on the night shift worker's sleeve. She knew the calculus of not having a roof when you needed one. She leaned forward and proposed small interventions: a mandatory short rest between double shifts, a reporting mechanism for emergency childcare, a temporary stipend for single parents facing sudden crises. These were not revolutionary. They were, in the arithmetic of systems, the building blocks of dignity. Ethan signed off on a package of interim measures, language tempered by legal counsel that insisted the changes be framed as pilots and audits rather than sweeping reform. He did not want to overpromise, but he wanted to create immediate cover for people like Scarlett. The company would not fix an industry overnight, but it could ensure that one plant's negligence did not leave a child shivering at a gate. As the directive circulated, there were murmurs on the plant floor. Some workers felt seen. Others bristled at the idea of new oversight. Change makes enemies and friends in equal measure. A few managers grumbled about precedent. A few workers smiled in the way of people who had been acknowledged for the first time in a long while. The change was not clean, it was human. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Scarlett had begun to tell pieces of her life with a caution that could be mistaken for indifference. She described nights filled with machines and the heavy, particular loneliness of factory hours. She had not wanted to be noticed, not because she was ashamed, but because noticing sometimes meant being asked to change something too big for one person to carry. Ethan listened as if learning a second language, one not of balance sheets, but of everyday courage. He learned about Ella's drawings. He learned that the red backpack had been a gift from a neighbor who sewed a patch on it. He learned how growth had been paid for in sleeplessness and how small kindnesses had kept them afloat. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as someone who had been in the wrong room when a child needed a hand. As the night gave way to morning, Ethan found himself driving back to the Coldwell house with Ella asleep in the passenger seat, a faint smile in the slackness of her face. The red backpack rested against the leather like a small, stubborn sign. He had thought, before that night, that his life would be measured in numbers and outcomes. Now he found metrics of a different sort accruing in his mind. The weight of a child's hand, the warmth of a borrowed coat, the temporary stopgap of a company's intervention. He knew the next steps would be political in the corporate sense, a web of meetings, memos, and negotiations. He also knew they would require a steadiness he had not been asked to show before, a willingness to create remedies that could be defended under scrutiny and scaled in ways that would not collapse into virtue signaling. He wanted change that lasted beyond headlines. When he walked into his office, his assistant greeted him with the news that coverage had already begun. Legal had advised caution, public relations had started drafting statements. The company's inbox, perpetually full, now sat like an instrument that could play a different chord. Ethan sat and wrote a note that was both practical and oddly intimate. He described a young girl's red backpack and a mother who had collapsed from exhaustion. He outlined an interim protocol and asked for a timeline. He signed it with one word that felt like an offering: accountability. Outside, the city moved on. The plant's night shift still hummed. Families opened doors and lit coffee and began their day. For some, the morning was a continuation of the usual. For others, it would be the first breath of a life altered by the ripple caused by a child's voice and a man's act. Ethan kept one of Ella's drawings on his desk. It was small and crooked and perfect. A house with 2 windows, a woman in the doorway, a dot of red on the porch. He pinned it beside the tidy line of memos and a photograph of a sunset over a skyline he had always loved. It was an inconvenient, modest thing, a reminder of a night when a small person had refused to be invisible. He had the power to initiate change, but he also had to learn to sit with its messes, the legal pushback, the operational friction, the human pride that made people resist help. His next move would be to ensure the directives were implemented without becoming a paper cascade that satisfied no one. Late that morning, a message arrived from the plant manager. The logs had been gathered. There were discrepancies needing clarification. The floor supervisor wanted to come in for a conversation. Ethan read the lines and felt a familiar tension that would, in time, reshape him. Leadership that chooses human care is chosen, not automatic. On a bench outside the hospital, Ella and Scarlett sat together under a weak sun. Ella's fingers found Scarlett's hand as naturally as breathing. Scarlett's eyes had a tired clarity. "We should go home," she said, and there was no smallness in it, only the fierce ordinariness of being a mother who had been found. They gathered their things, a bag that smelled faintly of oil and a child's red backpack. Scarlett put Ella on her hip, and, for a moment, the world reduced to their small orbit. She glanced at Ethan. No words at first, only a look that threaded gratitude, bewilderment, and an awareness that their lives had been shifted. "Thank you," she said again, simpler this time. It was not a request for anything in return. It was the sound a woman makes when someone has seen what is often missed. Ethan watched them leave. He knew the story did not belong to him to conclude. It belonged to them to live. His response had been the first ripple. He would be careful not to think himself the whole tide. And yet, in the quiet of his office, with the city thrum outside and the drawing on his desk, he made a decision not to retreat into the old metrics. He would not pretend to fix everything. He would, however, make sure that a child who had walked in the snow would have fewer reasons to do it again. He called his operations director and asked for a plan he could defend, one that would be rolled out incrementally, measured, and monitored. "Start with Holden," he instructed, "but make it scalable, pilot it. If it's useful, we extend it to other sites." There were sighs on the other end of the line, relief, skepticism, the sound of work finally beginning. Paper met will, and the small machinery of corporate care turned. Across town, Scarlett carried Ella up a narrow flight of stairs to an apartment that was humble and steady. She lit a small kettle and found 2 mugs. They ate the toast they could afford, and Scarlett told Ella about the time she had learned to fix the sewing machine when she was 15, how hands, even those tired from factory work, could mend and hold. Ella asked if she could draw the house with the red dot again. Scarlett said yes. That night, when Ella climbed into the small bed and the snow sang against the window, she dreamed of a house with warm light and a woman who came home. Scarlett sat at the kitchen table with a flashlight and drank tea into her palms. She folded the hospital bracelet into her wallet like a talisman and, for the first time in a long while, let herself imagine a future where phone calls could be answered without the worry of missing a shift next night. For Ethan, the day had altered him in a way that was not theatrical. It was an accumulation of small things: a child's voice, a hospital's beeping, the intimately human details of a life he had only ever been able to measure in margins. He was not a savior. He would not pretend to be. He was, he decided, going to be a lever, a man with enough reach to begin adjusting the fulcrum. The next steps were bureaucratic and tender, suited to the work of mending systems. He prepared memos and met with people who understood risk. He pushed for a short list of concrete changes: enforced 60-minute breaks for every 8 hours, a documented emergency childcare stipend, mandatory reporting of equipment failures, and an employee assistance line for single parents. It was not heroic. It was, nevertheless, something. Each directive would need to be negotiated, explained, and made persistent. The company would have to be taught to keep seeing the people whose hands kept its machines alive. It would be a messy, human project. As the week progressed, a photograph of Ella's crooked house made the rounds in Ethan's head like a small, stubborn refrain. It reminded him why this mattered. It made the meetings less abstract, and the memos less perfunctory. On a gray morning, as new memos circulated and supervisors convened, a small incident renewed the urgency of the work. A call came into Ethan's office from security. There had been a hiccup at the corporate headquarters, a security alert for an unaccompanied child near the west lobby. The words on the monitor were spare. The image on the desk surveillance feed showed a small figure with a red backpack. Ethan rose so fast his chair scraped. He had made changes to protect people miles away and now found his own life intersecting the consequences. He moved toward the elevator with a speed that was half instinct, half fear. The story that had begun with a girl's whispered sentence at a gate had not ended. It had only rerouted into places he had not imagined: the messy work of keeping a family safe and the awkward intimacy of becoming part of someone's day. He did not know yet how this new proximity would change the geometry of their lives. He only knew that when a small voice says a thing so true, "My mom didn't come home last night," it should not be met with silence. It should be the start of something practical and human and stubbornly kind. He moved toward the elevator with a speed that was half instinct, half fear. The security monitor had frozen on a small shape in the marble lobby, a red backpack like a bright punctuation against the gray tiles. Ethan's palms cut through the air as if he could part the distance. The elevator doors sighed open on the 7th floor, and he ran. Security radios crackled low and anxious. A guard met him at the top of the stairs, breath white in the cold of the stairwell air conditioning, and pointed toward a bank of palms by the west entrance. There, tucked behind a frond that smelled faintly of citrus, a child peered out with a face like a question mark. Ella had been drawn by light and by the strange machines of the building: the atrium fountain, the glass elevators, the anonymous men and women who moved with businesslike grace. She had followed the sound of a piano. Someone had started to warm the lobby for a small afternoon concert. And then, because the world was full of unguarded corridors to be explored, she had wandered. When Ethan reached her, she was shivering, not from cold this time, but from the residual fatigue of sleeping in unfamiliar places. Her eyes widened and then softened when she saw the man whose coat had once felt like a harbor. She said nothing at first. She only let herself be picked up with the quiet authority of a child who had learned quickly where safety sometimes lived. "Hey," Ethan said, keeping his voice deliberately low. "It's me. You're safe." She folded into him like a small thing that trusted warmth. The security guard, who had the plain honesty of someone who sees unexpected things every day, cleared his throat and asked the obvious questions. How did she get in? Who was she with? Was she lost? Ethan explained. He asked for the guard's help in contacting Scarlett. The guard frowned at the absence of a contact number in the little backpack, no phone, no emergency tag, and then the guard's radio squawked. A fire drill had initiated in the building. The alarms were scheduled for safety training. Someone had raised a hand. Someone had turned a required procedure into a timed coincidence. The sound would complicate things. They moved toward the lobby, and the piano's notes were cut by the distant, measured wail of an alarm. People began to stand, to gather their coats, to follow drills practiced until reflex. Security directed the front doors to be briefly locked for accountability. Ethan held Ella's hand, feeling again the small, stubborn pulse of a life that had stared long at machines and now found itself here. "Do you want to call your mom?" Ethan asked as they waited under the flood of office lights. Ella's eyes dropped. "Mom's at work," she said. "She said don't go into strange places." Ethan understood the sentence as a map of rules that kept children safe in broken systems. He stayed with her until the drill ended, until the emails announcing "all clear" rolled through the office like a tame drum. When the doors finally opened, Ethan asked security if they could check the building's CCTV, if perhaps someone had seen Scarlett leaving on her break, if one of the delivery drivers had noticed a woman with a red thermos and a tired face. They found video of Scarlett turning a corner in a raincoat, hair matted with oil and work dust. She moved with the same careful efficiency as every night she had worked, clocking in, clocking out, making someone else's deadlines feel like her own. Her face on the feed was momentary. It was ordinary. It was not the type of footage that demanded headlines. But the guard paused it and zoomed in on the timestamp. Last night's clock out was later than scheduled. The supervisor's log had marked an equipment failure 2 hours prior and an understaffing note that said someone had been asked to stay. Ethan watched the clip and felt a familiar machinery turn behind his ribs, the machinery of consequence. The alarm had been a coincidence. Ella's wandering had been another. The work he had started would have to stretch into the small crises life offered, and he would have to show up again. He drove Ella to the small apartment that was their home, the home that had housed hunger as well as love, and watched Scarlett open the door. She had been called by the plant's HR office. Someone had given her the elevator number and a sketch of where her daughter might be. When she saw Ella in Ethan's arms, there was a collision of relief and pride. She swallowed. She took the child and pressed her face into her daughter's hair, breathing in the smell of the borrowed coat. "I'm sorry," Scarlett said to Ethan, because adults offer apologies for the world's lack of mercy, as if saying sorry could fill a frayed place. "I don't know what she was thinking." "She's 6, Ethan said gently. "Children think with brave feet." Scarlett looked at him then with an expression that held the full complexity of gratitude and wariness, and, under it all, an awareness of dignity. "You don't need to do anything more," she said. She stopped. Pride is a currency that people like Scarlett spend carefully. Ethan did something small that would matter more than any declaration. He asked if she would come to Caldwell Industries for a conversation. He did not invent a grand rescue. He offered a job that would not skim her agency. Safer hours, steady pay, part-time shift work at corporate that included benefits and access to childcare resources the company had been building. He spoke plainly about responsibilities and about the accountability his firm intended to keep. He made clear the job was hers to accept or refuse. Scarlett considered the offer with the layered attention of someone whose life had been constructed around careful trade-offs. She had a laundry list in her head: rent, bills, the logistics of getting to a new job, the unfamiliarity of a corporate building, her own professional self-worth. She asked questions about the schedule, about the training, about whether she could still pick up evenings at the plant if extra pay was necessary. Ethan answered with the practical clarity he had learned to use. Paid orientation, a mentor for her first month, flexible days, guaranteed hours that wouldn't evaporate with a machine's sputter. He promised no theatrics. He promised a seat at the table where decisions were made. She left to think. She needed to sleep, to hold the night against the new idea. The door shut and the winter air swallowed the space between them. Scarlett talked it over with a neighbor who had once worked in logistics and who knew the worth of solid hours. She talked with the foreman who had been looking for ways to make things right. She considered the dignity of a choice made without shame. In the end, she accepted the offer, not because she needed charity, but because the work fit in the geometry of a life she was building for her daughter. Safer hours, predictable pay, and a plan for childcare on short notice. It was a practical bridge between two worlds. Her first day at Caldwell was a study in small kindnesses. Security greeted her with a badge and a smile. Human resources sat her down and walked through benefits in a language she found transparent and clear. There were training modules on software she had never used, and people who helped, quietly and without spectacle. Ella came with her on the first morning and was given a small corner in the employee lounge, a tiny oasis of crayons, paper, and a stack of picture books. Ethan, distant from the center of operations on purpose, sent someone with a thermos of cocoa and a small note that read, "For Ella, Mr. Warmcoat." Ella took to the office with a child's appetite for novel spaces. She staged a list of small, important things. The copier was loud and fun. The plants smelled like a forest. And the receptionist, an older woman named May who had grandchildren, poured her a juice box and listened to her stories as if each one were a gem. She drew her house again and gave the drawing to May, who slipped it into a frame behind the front desk. The crooked house was now part of the building's soft artifacts. Scarlett's co-workers watched her with the respectful curiosity reserved for someone stepping into a new life. Some offered help, an extra scarf, a contact for a reliable babysitter. Others kept their distance. But the workplace, which could have been a place of cold efficiency, slowly warmed around a woman who had been accustomed to doing the heavy lifting without applause. At Holden, the changes announced by the audit began to hum with the dirt and tedium of implementation. Supervisors underwent retraining that made them learn to log breaks as if lives depended on paper, because in a way, they did. Maintenance received priority funding for spare parts so lines would not be kept running at the cost of human exhaustion. An emergency stipend was set up to provide immediate short-term relief to employees whose lives were interrupted by hospital trips or the need for childcare. The changes were not universal. They were a pilot, a proof of concept, and a yardstick. Workers muttered in the break rooms, some skeptical, some hopeful. There were meetings, as there are in any organization, where people argued about precedent. But there were also quiet moments. A mechanic who had been bypassing a safety guard received a written acknowledgement for reporting hazards. A supervisor learned how to log a missed break without fear of being weak. A mother who had been scrounging for late-night babysitters was told about the emergency fund. Scarlett, who had always been practical about the small engines of survival, found herself becoming inadvertently political in the least partisan sense, advocating for the dignity of the people she worked with. She talked to other single parents in the plant, organized a small roster of families who could rely on temporary stipends, and became a modest point of trust for those who needed to ask for help without being branded weak. Ethan kept a cautious distance. He knew his presence could be misread as spectacle. He signed memos and left meetings to those who would have to live with the policy's clauses. He insisted on regular audits of the pilot, on data and on testimonies, and he held monthly forums where workers could speak without filters. At one of those forums, a line worker said something simple. "We just want to be treated like people who have nights too." The sentence landed in a room full of people who had been trained to listen to KPIs first and human voices second. Between the office and the plant, something shifted, small in any single gesture, but cumulatively significant. May's framed drawing on the lobby desk, Scarlett's badge clipped to a company sweater, the notices about emergency childcare posted on a corkboard for everyone to see. The company that had once been a collection of memos and metrics now had a visible, human ledger. Away from the meetings and the piloting, the private life of the three of them, Scarlett, Ella, Ethan, began to travel at a pace that honored their distinct needs. Ethan offered to help pay for a better winter coat for Scarlett. She refused at first because pride and independence were neither frivolous nor negotiable. He then suggested something less transactional. He offered to help arrange a more convenient schedule, to connect her with a mentor who could help with career development. She accepted that. He cooked pancakes awkwardly the first time and burned the edges. Ella declared them almost perfect, a child's way of awarding the effort. They built rituals. Ethan would drop Ella off at school on days when Scarlett's shift ran late. Scarlett would bring cookies to the office on Fridays as a quiet demonstration that she could hold two worlds. Ella created a game called Mr. Warmcoat, which involved finding the small kindnesses in a day and pinning them to the imagination like stickers. Her drawings multiplied: the crooked house with a red dot, the park, a man with a coat and a smile. Ethan placed one of these drawings on his office wall, where it lived among strategy projections and satellite photos, an inconvenient reminder that kept him tethered to why the memos mattered. The near miss at headquarters, the earlier lobby wandering, was not the only test their fragile constellations would face. One Tuesday, the building initiated a fire drill. The alarm's metallic cry had been scheduled and rehearsed. The drill triggered a cascade of reactions. Workers moved to stairwells, doors clicked into accountability positions, and an announcement reminded people to stay calm. Ella, who had been visiting during a school break, found the cacophony both alarming and curiously thrilling. Children are drawn to noise the way moths are to light. She slipped away from a temporary play area to look for a place where the sound made sense. The east exit led to a loading dock and a thin alley that smelled of salt and oil and late lunches. She wandered out, clutching a packet of crayons, and found a cold, hidden place beside a dumpster where pigeons scolded the world. The drill made the building's outward doors lock for a moment, protocol to ensure nobody left amid smoke, and surveillance footage captured her small form slipping into the periphery. Security found her there because someone noticed a child was missing during head count. The camera image was grainy, and the stairwell phone blasted the alarm. Ethan, who had been at a meeting when the alert came in, felt something physical in his chest. He ran. He found her crouched behind a cardboard box, looking at the world as if it were an instruction booklet she had yet to read. The alley was wind-bitten, the walls smelling of damp and rust. A security guard had one hand on her shoulder and a flashlight in the other. He looked up at Ethan with a mix of relief and reprimand. The reprimand was for the situation's risk, not for the child. "Ella," Ethan said, kneeling so that their faces matched heights, "you okay?" She nodded, not because she was, but because it was an easier shape of a reply. Her eyes had found that small thing inside people who had been kind to her, a pocket of safety. He scooped her up and found himself furious at the machinery of schedules and protocols that let a child wander into danger. His anger was practical, not theatrical. He used it to press for better internal protocols, a requirement that visitors be supervised, that a temporary child supervision policy be created for employees whose children were in the building for brief visits, that security cameras be monitored with a more attentive center. He refused to let bureaucratic friction become an excuse. Scarlett, who had learned to hold trauma at a distance lest it swallow her day, found herself shaking. She had been at home when the call came that her child had been found at the loading dock. She rushed to the building not with recrimination, but with a particular kind of exhausted gratitude. She took Ella in her arms in a way that made something in Ethan's chest unclench. He watched the two of them and knew that his role was to be consistent, not dramatic. That night, after Ella had been tucked into bed and the office's drama subsided, Ethan and Scarlett sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea between them. The conversation unfolded into practicalities: a discussion of how to keep Ella safe during occasional visits, a plan for emergency contacts, a small stipend for childcare when a child had to be on site. They spoke with a candor that felt both new and necessary, about privacy, about boundaries, about the rhythm of a life being reconstructed. "I don't want to be your charity case," Scarlett said at one point, the words blunt and honest. "I don't want people to think I'm here because you feel noble." "I don't want that either," Ethan replied. "I want partnership. I want to make sure you have choices." She considered him, the man who had, with steady hands, moved from stranger to someone whose actions matched his words. It mattered to her that the help came with respect, not spectacle. It mattered that he did not try to fix every problem from the top down. It mattered that he asked rather than decided. As the pilot programs continued, Caldwell Industries found itself not only changing policy, but shifting the stories people told about the company. One manager, practical, stubborn, found himself mending schedules with a new care. An HR analyst who had watched Ella at the office became a champion of a scaled rollout. Community organizations requested meetings. The pilot showed measurable reductions in missed shifts due to emergency hospitalizations and a modest increase in employee satisfaction surveys. Numbers did not tell the whole story, but they told enough to justify continued investment. A year after the night in the snow, the company hosted a small gala to celebrate community partnerships and to raise funds for the employee assistance programs that had been seeded in the pilot. It was a muted affair, intentionally so, no ostentation, a simple dinner with local stakeholders and workers invited as guests. Ethan spoke. He did not give the grand speech he had once written in a boardroom. He spoke in a voice that had been softened by months of listening. "There are ways companies can measure success," he said, "and then there are other ways. Tonight, I'd like to invite someone up who doesn't need a speech to make her part of the story. She needs recognition." Scarlett had been sitting at a table near the back with Ella tucked close, the child's red backpack beside her like a talisman. When Ethan called her forward, she hesitated, in that way people do when they know all eyes will find them, but they also know their own quiet truth. The hall fell into a hush that felt like respectful curiosity. Ethan took Scarlett's hand and offered her a white rose pin. It was not an ornate thing, just a small lapel pin in the shape of a rose, white as a promise of dignity. He explained the gesture without dramatics. "This is for all the people whose work keeps a city running while the rest of us sleep. It's small, but it's ours, as an acknowledgement that people's lives matter." He did not make her a symbol without her consent. He asked her permission to be acknowledged publicly. Scarlett accepted the pin and looked out at the room. The applause was not for Ethan. It was for the woman who, by virtue of being herself, had forced people to see what had been invisible. Faces in the crowd were familiar. The HR analyst who had pushed for the pilot, the foreman who had adjusted schedules, co-workers who had stood in break rooms and held court about hard things. When Ethan stepped back and let her speak, she did so in a voice that was plain and steady. "I didn't ask to be an example," she said. "I just wanted my kid to be safe. But if what happened to me can change something for someone else, then good. I want my daughter to know she's not a problem to be solved. She's just my girl." Later that night, after the applause and the photos and the brief interviews that left everything feeling both tender and raw, Ethan walked Scarlett and Ella out into the snow. The night was not as vicious as the week their story had begun. The city had a softness, a tolerance for small miracles. He took a breath, and then, in the low light of a taxi stand, he made a small, private proposal. He did not kneel. That would have been a scene for a film, not an honest human request. Instead, he took from his coat pocket the white rose pin, the same kind he had placed on her lapel, and he offered it as a bridge. "I can't fix everything," he said, "and I won't pretend to. But I want to be someone who shows up, not because I'm your rescuer, but because I choose to be part of your life. Would you let me?" There was silence that was not empty. Scarlett weighed the gestures he'd made over the months, the memos that had become real, the mornings she had driven them to school, the way he had listened without expecting repayment. She thought of Ella's small hand in hers, of the nights they had been found, of the work that still needed doing. She thought of herself, not as someone being saved, but as someone choosing. "Let me think," she said, and the sentence felt true because it honored the gravity of choice. She did not say yes because she owed it. She said yes later, in a small kitchen with cereal bowls and the morning sun, when she saw how Ethan folded milk into her daughter's cheeks like someone learning how to be gentle. They became a family, not by a single public act, but by thousands of small, private ones. Shared dinners, contested chores, arguments about bedtime and backpacks, fights over who left the light on. Ethan learned how to make pancakes that would pass Ella's exacting standards. Scarlett learned names of his colleagues. Ella learned that a grown man's hug could be a steady thing. They found normal in the messy places where normal hides. Caldwell Industries continued its measured rollout. The pilot became a program with oversight, budget lines, and quarterly reviews. The emergency fund was replenished by a combination of corporate giving and community donations. An independent committee was set up to review plant compliance and worker safety. Ethan visited the plant floor not as a man auditing boxes, but as someone who had been changed by the contours of a life he had once considered peripheral. He sat at tables with workers, listened, and carried stories back to the boardroom that could not be reduced to charts. Scarlett's life did not become untroubled. There were late nights, misunderstandings, and days when the bills felt closer than comfort. But she had a job that respected her body clock, a colleague who recommended a tutor for Ella, and a city that knew, in small ways, how to stop a child from having to step into a storm alone. One winter evening, 3 months after the gala, they sat at a tiny table in their kitchen. Ella was drawing, the cricket house of course, when the phone buzzed with a message. Another company had requested to meet with Caldwell's HR team to learn about the pilot. The story rippled outward in ways that made Ethan careful and proud. He picked up Ella's drawing and pinned it on a corkboard he kept near his desk at the company, where plans and memos lived. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. "Do you remember the night?" Ethan asked, and his voice had the soft weathering of someone who had walked a long corridor. Scarlett looked up. "Every time Ella leaves the house without the red backpack," she said, half joking, half serious. The red backpack had been patched and repatched, and now bore a small stitched heart where once a sewing neighbor had sewed a patch. They left for a small evening together, just the three of them, into a snowfall that made the world muffled and slow. Ella, bundled in a warm coat now, held her backpack like an amulet and waved a hand to the city lights. Scarlett took Ethan's hand before getting into the car, a small gesture that meant the practical intimacy of shared responsibility. They drove into the night, an ordinary family in a not-so-ordinary world. Ethan did not imagine he had rewritten the city's story. He knew reforms needed continued care, audits, and accountability. But he had been part of a thing that turned a child's cold into a warm hearth, if only for a night, and then kept the work going. At home, the pancakes were slightly burned, as usual. The crockery was chipped. Ella's drawing went on the fridge, held by a magnet that read, simply, "Belong." Scarlett brewed tea with an expertise that was as comforting as any sermon, and Ethan washed the dishes in an unpracticed but steady rhythm. The white rose pin was tucked into a small corkboard beside a string of photographs. Scarlett at work, Ella with her class, a candid of Ethan reading a bedtime story. Outside, the city hummed on. Inside, a kettle hissed and then sang. They ate breakfast at a table that had once been assembly line alone, now noisy with forks and speech. There was no grand ending, only a life that continued with less fear than it had before. Before they left the apartment, Ella tucked a new drawing into Ethan's jacket pocket. A house with 2 windows, a crooked roof, a woman in the doorway, and a man with a coat. On the porch was a tiny red dot. Ethan closed the jacket over the drawing and felt the small gravity of what it meant to be woven into someone's life. He helped buckle Ella into her seat, and then finally turned to Scarlett and said quietly, "Will you marry me someday?" Scarlett laughed, the sound threaded with affection and caution. Let's start with living together and not burning the pancakes, she replied. And the exchange contained everything necessary: humor, a promise of slow building, and the openness to a future neither of them could fully script. Ethan nodded, accepting the terms of a life that would be negotiated day by day. They left into the snow, the car's heat radiating a domestic glow that was small and sure. The city light smeared like watercolor. The red dot on the drawing in his pocket was a stubborn thing, a beacon of what matters. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who believes in second chances. Small acts ripple outward. Sometimes a child's voice can change the way an entire organization learns to see.